Okay, with that, I'll go ahead and get started. I feel pretty lucky to actually be at this time of the morning. I know we're 2 hours in, and so I'm sure everybody will be snoozing rather than listening to me. And so that will deal with nerves a little bit. No, just kidding. But it's been a really appropriate session to attend, starting with Dr. Black talking about the little red hen and the time it takes to complete tasks, as well as Dr. Drost and his cover crops. If you look in this picture, I'm holding cover crops, so those are taken at the end of July, even though they are more of a cool season cover crop and they only have 45 days of growth, and they doubled in size by the time we actually harvested off. And then also Sheridan with her mentioning how we're losing a lot of ag land. And so this picture that's behind my head is actually that of Harriman, looking at the difference in ag land between 1999 and 2019, green being what was gobbled up. And then, all of these tools that we tend to deal with in production, that we have them for a reason. And so I will go ahead and advance the slide. And those reasons are: you want to shorten your task time, and so you use a tool. You want to reduce physical labor, so you use a tool or piece of machinery. And then often using tools and machinery can also increase our precision with the work that we do, which has a lot of yield benefits and quality benefits. Before we go further, though, I want to talk a little bit about opportunity cost, which has to do with economics. Now, I'm not an economist, but I've learned from economists that opportunity cost is you are sacrificing divided by what you can gain in return from that sacrifice. And when we look at opportunity cost today, we're going to be talking about it in the time to make that tool pay for itself in years. And so opportunities, both costs and gains, can be implicit or explicit. An example of an implicit opportunity is to spend more time with your little kids. On my place, if we did all of our chores by hand, we would never be able to spend time with our kids with all the stuff that had to be done. Or also, maybe I could go out to Maverick and get a job for $15 an hour, and that's potential income. So that's also an implicit opportunity. An explicit opportunity would be something that actually affects cash flow. So if I have to pay a worker $15 an hour or pay myself $15 an hour to do the job, and I can cut that out, that's an explicit example of opportunity. So let's look at soil prep tools first, just because those tend to be the things we start the season off with, or when we're starting a new operation, we definitely have to break ground and get that operation going, unless we're doing, unless the ground was already in pretty good shape and we're trying some sort of no-till or some other method. But for the most part, you're doing some type of soil prep, and that has to occur multiple times throughout the year. So I've got 3 examples for you. On the left, I've got a rear tine rototiller. My machine was $850. You can get them a little bit cheaper, and sometimes they're more expensive. But they do have a primary usage, and that is mostly as some sort of piece of tillage equipment, whether that's primary or secondary tillage. I prefer to use tillers for secondary tillage, where we've already softened up the ground a little bit, cut all the roots up, got the rocks and concrete or whatever else, if you're in a urban situation, out of the ground, and now we're just creating a nice soft even seed bed. Your 2-wheel tractors plus an implement can be really useful, just because you can take that tiller off of the back and put a different tool on to give yourself some other application from that. And so there's many applications to 2-wheel tractors and conventional tractors, and I've got the prices listed for those. Now with a tractor, that price can skyrocket into the hundreds of thousands of dollars range, or even be down around the $12,000 range. But I thought for most operations that would be related to what we're doing today, you'd probably be in that $15,000 range for a new tractor. And so we'll see when these tools are worth it versus when they're not worth owning. So right here, I've got a picture of some ground at my place where I set up 6 plots that are adjacent to each other, so that from right to left or left to right, they're right next to each other, and then they're moving down the row. And they're 10 by 4 feet each, so 40 square feet each. And I decided to do some tests with these plots. And so I'll move ahead to the next slide for that. So on the left, you can see these 3 plots, which equal 120 square feet total. They were tilled with that rototiller that I had showed in previous slides. And in fact, it's up there at the top. And then on the right, where the white dog is, just below the white dog, you can see that I used a shovel. It's just laying there on the ground to prep those 3 beds on the right. And I just, as quickly as I could, where I thought I could sustain the labor for a few hours if I had to, I just turned that soil over with the shovel. The reason I did it was to repeat it a few times just in case I had a little bit of a learning curve for the beginning of the day for the task, or to make sure that I could do the job consistently. So I repeated each task. Right here in this slide, I'm showing you the results after I harrowed them both down. So I actually took a 12-foot piece of chain link fence and I drug it across the plots, just so they would end up being the same by the end of the work. I only had to drag the chain link across one way and then back the other way on the tilled ground, and then on the hand-worked stuff, I did do it quite a few times. But if I had an actual harrow, say behind a tractor or four-wheeler or you know, riding lawnmower or something, I probably could have knocked it down in the same amount of time rather than having that lightweight fence go across. So I won't penalize that on time, but that is something to consider, that getting that seed bed, if you're doing it straight with hand tools, could take a lot longer to prepare even after you've done your primary / secondary tillage. And so I wanted to visualize the time that it would take for 1/10 of an acre to be prepped with these 4 different pieces of equipment. So the tiller, we were under 2 hours if we were doing 1/10 of an acre. We're well below that with a 2-wheel tractor and a conventional tractor, versus our shovel, which would have almost taken us 10 hours to do. And we won't focus too much on charts like this. That's just to give you a good visual so you can visualize these numbers as we're thinking about them on the right hand side. And granted, I understand this is a little small, but I'll walk you through it. So you can see that I replicated my work 3 times, rep 1, rep 2, rep 3. And then with that tiller, rather than turning around in each plot, that would have messed with the time. And so if we go back and look at those previous slides, I actually drove through all 3 of them. Just because for the most part, you're not going to be dealing with beds that tiny all at once if you're working efficiently. You're going to try to prep a couple of beds that are all in succession like that, unless your space prohibits that. And so they ended up being the same because I took the time to do all 3 of them and divided that by 3. Over here, we've got gray. So where you see gray words, that's where I had to model it or use a calculation based off of how the implement moves through. I didn't want to bring university equipment onto my own place. It would have been hasslesome, and then I didn't want anybody to complain that I was gaining something from it. And so I took the speed that the tool moves, miles per hour, while doing the task, and I just use some maths with the square footage to calculate those timings. And then here's my soil prep by hand. You can see that first one was a hair slower than the other two because I really got into a rhythm with it during those final two replications. Then we've got our average here. And then as we move down, we can look at the hours it would take to do that task if we were on an acre, a half acre, a quarter acre, or a tenth of an acre. And then all of our examples where we calculate opportunity cost and all of those things, they'll be done on a tenth of an acre basis. But let's just look at if you had an acre of land and you were using just a regular 19-inch tiller, it would take you 13 hours to get all of those beds prepped across an acre of land, closer to 14 actually, versus 100 acres or 100 hours, excuse me, for that same acre. And then if you had a tractor, obviously you cut that way down, and that's why big agricultural producers use that type of equipment. And then, you know, I already explained our tenth of an acre where we're at 1.5 hours versus 10 hours here. And so let's calculate our opportunity cost. I figured for the most part, a lot of us will have to do multiple successions throughout the year where we bring a crop in, let's say with Dan's cover crops, we got to work that ground to get that incorporated. And then we've got to get that crop planted and then maybe taken off again, or even we got to prep our bed after that residue's rotted in. So we're going to have 4 successions throughout the year, depending on what we're growing, if we're taking crops off and putting new ones in and so on. And so all of our opportunity is assuming that we do the task 4 times during that growing season. And so with a shovel, if we did a tenth of an acre 4 times, we're at about 40 hours versus our 5.5 with the tiller. Let's now equate that into the cost of labor to do that task. If we're paying $15 an hour, like what could soon be mandated, or if it was something that was going to be worth it to ourselves, I don't think I would go and do pick up a second job if it were below that for me in my situation. And that's why I chose that number. So it would take us roughly $600 in labor or lost wages if we went and got our job at Maverick to do that chore versus the $82. And so when we calculate opportunity cost or our time to break even with purchasing that tool, we look at the difference between these two. So I subtract this from this. And then we take that big sacrifice of that $850 and we divide that by the difference that we just calculated. And it comes out that a rototiller for a tenth of an acre of production ends up taking about a little over 1.5 years to pay ourselves back through that opportunity that we gained. And if you're looking at the other equipment, and we'll go on to the next slide because it makes it a little bit prettier to look at this. If we're looking at the 2-wheel tractor on a tenth of an acre, that is if we're only using it for soil prep. These can be used for other tasks, but only for soil prep. It'd be 10 years to pay that off. And so if I'm a new producer that's figuring out, hey, do I even want to do this 5 years down the road? Maybe I don't want to buy either of these pieces of equipment because that could be a huge waste of money because I'm never going to be earning that back. And so if you're exploring the idea of getting into this urban farming atmosphere, maybe focus on those tools that are around 2 years or less. Because if you find out you're burned out 2.5 years down the road, you're going to be on KSL trying to sell a lot of equipment, hoping to recover that initial investment. Also, when you're just exploring this, avoid purchasing things on credit. Once you're a professional farmer and you can go to the farm service agency and you know it's going to work and you know you're going to stick with it, that's when you can start to use credit as an advantage. But we're in tax season right now. A lot of us have gotten stimulus payments, so consider using cash if you're in that cohort of farmers. So that's just a plug in, just because I don't want anybody to feel like they've financially devastated themselves off of going for this type of operation. Obviously, it includes risk, but try to minimize those for yourself when you're starting off. And so, well, let's go back and talk about that a little bit more. So if we do have a larger piece of ground, you can see that that tool wheel tractor drops down to a little over 4 years to pay itself back, as well as, and you could complicate this by depreciating out your opportunities and your costs out over 5 years. But I wanted to keep it simple for 1 year, especially for those people that are just starting out. And then if you have a ½ acre, that's a 2-year payback. And then you can see that same situation with the larger piece of equipment too. So let's move over to planting tools. These are tools that you would use to put seeds into the ground where they're going to be growing. So not seeding indoors, but seeding outdoors, sowing, if you will. I've got 3 different tools here. One of them's repeated. So this one on the left-hand side towards the bottom is called a jang seeder. They come in models JP1 through 6. I've got 1, 3, and 5 listed there. So a JP3 would have 3 rows that it would be planting at once. You've got this earthway seeder. I own one of these as well, and they're certainly a nicely priced tool, but they don't tend to seed lightweight seeds very well because their pickup is on the side of that hopper, or small seeds, especially when you have those small little packs when you're planting really expensive stuff. So I'm thinking, you know, cut flower production, it would be difficult to use that type of seeder. But with larger, they're still a great tool. And then you have this 6-row seeder that Johnny's makes. That's for really tight, high density plantings. And so there's the point of showing you these is that there are a lot of tools out there. I have the most experience with the earthway seeder. This box right here is my JP3 that is being shipped right now. And if you look at the costs over here, I've got a big swing in price on the Jangs. And the reason for that is where you buy it and what model you get. I think at US online retailers, the JP3 is probably somewhere around $1,200. I bought mine directly from one of the factories in China that produces it for $410. I wouldn't recommend that yet though, because I don't know if I got ripped off or not, but I'm at least performing the experiment, if you will, to see if there are benefits to that. And so price can vary with these, but for the most part, they can look like they have a pretty high price tag. But let's look and see what that opportunity cost actually ends up being when we're thinking about the time that it's going to take us to perform the task. So I bring up our spreadsheet from before, except this has to do with planting. And so on the left-hand side, I've got those same labels from the first spreadsheet. And here in the middle, I've got using a seeder. So for our example, that would be a JP3. And then over here, sowing by hand. So in those same plots that I showed you earlier, that 120 square feet total, what is the time that it takes to put in 8 rows on one of those little 40 square foot replications? Again, we're gray here because I don't have my JP3 yet, but I watched 4 or 5 videos and kind of timed how quickly they moved through the rows as they were pushing the seeder. And then I went and modeled it myself with with just another tool. And so I've got that there modeled, of course, and then I went and sowed by hand my 8 rows and then replicated it. I didn't sow actual seed just because actual seed that I wanted to grow, just because most of the stuff that I wanted to grow, the seed's very expensive and I didn't want to waste anything in the winter. So I actually took coriander seeds and just stuck those in the ground in place of something that'd actually be growing. And so you can look at the average time in seconds for those plots. Again, we look at acreage, 250 hours almost to seed an acre at those high levels of density. So that's 1,600 plants per 4 by 100-foot bed. This could have been done in the olden days because usually their rows were far more spread out. They had less plants, less density, and they had a lot of help, which are things that you're unlikely to have. You're going to want things in tight in that urban situation, and you're going to probably not have a family with 12 to 15 kids plus neighbors that can all help. And so let's move down to our 1/10 of an acre operation. Just under an hour to use the seeder versus a whole day, 24 hours. And then we're adding 4 successions because we're going to plant that lettuce or whatever we were doing, spinach, whatever, 4 times throughout the year, and then take it off. And so you can look at the difference in labor there. And so how quickly does that pay itself off? I'm using my example on this slide of spending $410. And you can see within 1/3 of a growing season, I've already covered that cost because planting takes time. And I get a lot more precision using the machine than I would by hand. We just don't have time to really delve into that. Some more planting tools. So not all plants are going to be put out in the beds as a seed. They'll be grown indoors and then transplanted. So there are other tools for that. For example, this paper chain transplanter. There's a couple different companies that make them. I was pretty against them. I thought, with a dibbler, I can get them in fast. And then I looked at the analysis. And so we'll get there here in just a second. And then you've got drop seeders and vacuum seeders, and those are mostly for setting trays. You also have tools for creating your little soil blocks. And so our retail price is worth it. Well, when we look at transplanting by hand versus using a paper pot transplanter, you can see that it quickly pays for itself, even though the cost of the tool is around $1,000. And I actually went out and ordered one right after I used my test. Now, obviously, I didn't own one yet, and so I had to use videos and then calculate it and model it. And then I didn't have plants ready to transplant, so I actually took soil blocks that I made and I transplanted them, but I'm still counting that as me modeling it, just because I couldn't tell if it'd go in straight or not. And then I'm getting close to time, but there are a few other things to cover still. This would be nice to have a whole session on. But starting seeds indoors, think about the time that it takes to do that. Soil blocking, 10 trays worth with 50 soil blocks in each, about an hour. Versus some of these other things, hand seeding, about a half hour for 10 trays versus 1/10 of an hour. And that's with 50 plants each. If you have more cells, it obviously takes longer. And then weeding. Weeding is one of those other chores that you spend a lot of time on. And so that's going to be really dictated by what your goals are, how you're limiting yourself, what types of weeding you're allowing yourself to do, whether you're organic or not. And then what's the situation of your ground? Are you just infested with weeds, or are you pretty well off right now? You can see that the time in doing a 10 by 4 foot plot in seconds really changes. We get close to about, we're around a minute and a half if you've only got less than a plant per square foot. But once you start to get into those 4 plants per square foot, that time really starts to jump up. And there are a lot of ways and tools that you have at your disposal when it comes to weed control. You have mechanical means, so tilling, chopping, cutting, mowing, burning. You've got prevention, which is always your greatest tool. You've got cultural methods, so using weed barrier. That's one of my favorites. I like that and a mixture of tillage, and then with some smart use of chemical spray to control those weeds that aren't going to be affected, that are in a different weed classification from the crop that I'm growing. And so right here is just another example where I've got not bindweed, excuse me, but a lot of Bermuda grass. Tillage is not going to be effective. All I'm doing is replanting that Bermuda grass. It's going to take some other means to get rid of that. A good one would be weed paper or weed barrier in that situation. And then obviously we have more tools. I think as a farmer, you can really save money on some things if you know how to build it. So get yourself a good drill, circular saw, sawzall, maybe even a miter saw. And you can build some of those things like those drop seeders where it costs $600 to buy, even though the materials only cost $20, $30 and 2 hours to drill the holes and build it. And then obviously you have your conventional hand tools that are listed here. But I want to leave time for just a couple questions. I'm sorry that I rushed through the
Oh, where did it go? There's too many. If you own 2+ acres and have to mow the area you don't farm, what do you recommend? And taking into consideration the resale value of the tractor.
Okay, so to be honest, I probably wouldn't buy a tractor if I'm 2 acres or down regardless. You're able to rent tractors. It's about $150 to rent the tractor for the day. And you can rent a large, let's say 70 horsepower tractor for $150 and get all of that mowed down, especially if you're not watering all of that weedy area. So you'd want to pick, right when those flower heads are starting to occur on the thistle and a few of those other tall weeds, and you go and you knock it down right then, and then you're going to be producing a lot less seed. Or if there's grass there, you're not going to get a lot of regrowth if that's not getting watered. And so I would rent, and worst case scenario, you're going to have to mow it twice a year unless you're watering it. And then maybe you need to consider buying something bigger. But you could, if it's just mowing that you're worried about, you could beg or borrow somebody that's got a big mower, or you could even buy one of those little John Deere riding mowers. They're about $1,500 to $2,000, and that's a lot cheaper than a tractor. And it's about the same price as an implement that you would buy to put behind something else.